I'm Catherine Kingsley.
And I'm Catherine Stern.
And this is
Contemplating Culture,
a missionary walk through a secular age. Together we journey through A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, a book looking at the history and philosophy of how the world got where it is, and the impacts of our contemporary culture for us today as missionaries.
And we're inviting you to join the conversation.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Contemplating Culture.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our online studio.
So for those of you that don't know, Kat has recently moved to Melbourne, so we're now in 2 different locations, so we're going to try something else out. So today we move into a new chapter in the book A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, chapter 7. It's called The Impersonal Order, and we'll get into what that means today. But it's the last chapter in this bigger section that we've been looking at called The Turning Point. And one of the key things we've been looking at in this kind of movement in human history in the West is the idea of Deism. And so particularly we've been looking at the anthropocentric shift that has happened as part of that. So today we move into the next phase of that. It's just a tiny little chapter, but we're looking at, well, this is what it meant for us, but what does it mean for God, and particularly how we see God?
So Taylor uses the example of, or uses the terminology of God moving from being an agent in our world to being seen merely as the architect of our world. So what does that mean in real terms? Well, in real terms, I think about it as, well, in my life, I expect that I can have a personal relationship with God, one where I talk to him about what's going on and he talks back to me, where I expect him to be active in my life and in the world around me, directly intervening even in the things that happen. But for the Deists, God is merely the person who sets up the world as the backdrop and leaves us to do everything, and we shouldn't expect that God can intervene or is part of our daily living.
And Taylor uses a really interesting term here that for me, like I'm quite visual, I quite enjoyed this term when I read it. He calls it the ratchet effect. This idea that if you've ever used a ratchet, it's the kind of spanner that you're turning around, but instead of having to keep turning round and round, there's just a little notch and it clicks into the notch so you don't have to go back as far. And you can't actually go backwards from that point. It's only forwards. And that's kind of what he means here. We're hitting a point, a turning point in thought that even though some of the threads from this might not be picked up for a few hundred years, it's like a locking point where it's only forward. You can't go back to a world before this kind of shift.
And the shift, if you like, comes directly out of what we've discussed before as the triumph of reason, this idea that everything we can work out from reason is what is true and what is real and is what is reliable. And the Deist ratchet movement, I guess, is to replace religion and what they would label as superstition with reason and science. And Taylor in this chapter wants to dispute that this is the whole story. He wants to dispute that science fully replaces what religion had before. And he points out that they're discounting completely the whole human experience of God. They're not counting that as part of the picture, as part of the story that they're telling. They're missing a whole aspect of human life in the pieces of the puzzle that they're putting together.
Can you give us some examples of what he might mean by that?
Well, he uses the example of like a relatively recent mystics around that time of John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, or a more contemporary Christian example of the time of John Wesley, people for whom God was a daily part of their life, who experienced God as responding to them in a particularly personal way and intervening in the world around them and in life around them. And he's saying these people, their stories, they're being discounted as superstitious enthusiasts, other labels that you can put on them perhaps. They're not actually taking into account the fact that these people potentially are telling the truth, sharing real experience.
That's good. And that's, I think we'll pick it up later today, but it's one of the key things when you're moving in this Deist mindset or even with the undertones of it in your thought, is that it's problematic when you encounter instances of God actually interacting, because you're moving from a mindset where you're not expecting God to interact. So if someone's claiming that he does, it's problematic. So we move now into, Taylor says there's kind of two strands that this shift away from God as agent to God as the architect is kind of happening. And he just wants to kind of finger them out for us. So the first one is in the area of natural science. So it's this whole idea that we've talked about many times of disenchantment, where the rise of the natural sciences meant that we could kind of debunk the spiritual or the other kind of meanings in things, that things were just things. And he calls this like a shift from meaningful, purposeful, causal powers. So there was a reason why things were happening, to a universal causal laws. So just everything's flat and generic, that sense of universal. And so this is the shift that kind of happens. And I just find it really fascinating that in this movement, this sense of purpose in what we're encountering in the world kind of gets to be lost.
Yeah, it's like once you take out that expectation of God as an agent in the world, as God as someone who is active and directly part of and caring about everything that's going on, you also take out any sense of purpose and meaning that God, like as agent, even as architect, has set up the world with particular purposes in mind. So it's like, an architect designs a house, for instance, and they might have put a spa bath in, and in their heads, the point of a spa bath is for relaxation, and perhaps there's some like health-giving purpose in that spa bath as well. But if you take the architect and their purpose and opinions out of the day-to-day interaction with that house and its current owners, then I can come along and I see a receptacle which you can fill with water, and I can make up meaning for that. I could fill it with dirt instead of water and make it into an exotic kind of garden, indoor garden in my bathroom that I grow all sorts of ferns and indoor plants, and it looks absolutely beautiful. And the fact that the purpose of this was originally something else doesn't matter, because the architect simply designed the house. He didn't design it with purpose or meaning.
And I mean, that's probably a further shift. So if you look at the level of natural law, that would have been one of the movements. And that would have said, well, he did design it with purpose and meaning. And your job is to figure out what that purpose and meaning is. So the Deist shift is one step further then. And that's the progression we've been following. So the natural law would have said, well, he designed it, and using your reason, you could figure out what he designed it for. The Deist shift is one step further. And I would say even more so than there's no purpose in that. You're not expecting anyone to come into the house and to engage with you. You're not expecting the architect to walk in and go, whoa, 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 what's going on? It's that expectation around God and what we think of God and what we're expecting to happen in our lives in relation to God, that he kind of is a beginning and end kind of God in this realm. He sets it up and he'll judge you at the end, but there's no expectation that he'll come in the day to day.
Absolutely. So, like, if something goes wrong with that spa bath, there's nothing I can't, I've got to work out and then how to fix it myself as well. There's no expectation that the God who designed it will also help me fix it or work with me in using it or whatever.
Yes, that he's given you everything you need is
Yes.
very much the architect model. Go find the tool shed and all of that kind of thing. And so I guess then the second kind of strands running through that Taylor wants to look at is in the realm of human science. So here it's we've looked at the natural science as like the laying flat of the physical world. This is the laying flat of things in the human world. So he looks at history and time, and we're wanting all things to be understood in the same lens of something that happened 1,000 years ago needs to be treated with the same kind of detail that something that happened yesterday, that there's no sense of sacred or higher or gathered that we've talked about before. And then he talks about language and kind of some of the movements that happen in history. And what we're left with is then this big movement of biblical criticism that is trying to bring that enlightened reason mind to scriptural texts and things that were once considered sacred. This, not that they're no longer sacred, but they're no longer exempt from the realm of reason. And so it now is possible for miracles to be brought into question. The stories that we're trying to find reason of how this thing happened, explanations for how it happened, instead of leaning on the miraculous. And one of the other movements in this time, I think, as well, is the possibility of doctrine being false. And he talks about a couple of writers around this time that start to act as though it's possible. Not that they ever say this doctrine is false, but they approach doctrine with that mindset that it's possible. And as we were saying earlier, it might take a few hundred years for someone to pick that up. But I would say now, in our kind of Christian realm, we have this term cafeteria Catholic or cafeteria Christian, someone who comes in and picks different ideas and then discards other ones, that people are left in the realm of believing that they're free to choose what's true and what's not. There's no longer a sacred exemption for the things in the Bible and for things, of the church. And this is at this point, when this Deist movement is happening, that's when the ratchet's happening. We might not see its effects for a few hundred years, but this is the turning point. We can't go back to now. We're at the point where if you're not questioning things of your faith, then you're stupid. You're in that realm of superstition, of enthusiastic, of fanaticism, that to be a meaningful, rational, like acceptable human, you need to be questioning. And that's, I guess, the shift that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because what you're left with, I guess, is you've got, okay, on one end of the spectrum, you've got where we haven't got yet. We've got atheism, where there is no God. Down the spectrum, we've got deism, where God is, but God's the architect, God's the first cause. We don't expect anything in the day-to-day of God. He set the world up and he's going to judge us at the end. And that's all. At the other end of the spectrum, you have like Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, John Wesley, Moses, people who expect that God is present and active in our life. I talk to him, he talks to me, he cares about what's going on. He'll even intervene along the way in my life, and I can see his fingerprints in all that I do. But along this like spectrum, I guess Deism has left us with lots of positions or what I would call images of God along the way. And one of them I would see like as fairly close to Deism or Deism itself, really, and that is this sense of like God still sits in my mindset. It's probably like a step further than Deism. If there's a good God in the world, then surely he would prevent, and he was active in the world, then surely he would prevent suffering.
Mm.
Surely he would prevent disasters. But the fact that that earthquake happened and these people suffered and died points logically and reasonably to me that either there is no God or God is not good or God does not intervene in the world. They're the only conclusions that I can come to from that. The same person looks at what I point out as a miracle, I prayed and the waters parted, and they're like, it's a coincidence. Science can explain it. There's some reason the winds did something weird today. And if you traced back scientifically, you'd see that something had happened on the other side of the world that had caused that. That expectation sitting in me that this is God is just gone from their thinking.
And this brings up a really fascinating point. I've got a quote here from Taylor. He's talking about how the modern story would say that all of this is a result of science and reason, but actually Taylor's saying there's something else at play. So he says the slide to deism was not just the result of reason and science, but reflected a deep-seated moral distaste for the old religion that sees God as an agent in history. He's saying that there's something in us already there.
He is. And he's also pointing out that, if you sit in that mindset, you've actually got a less than logical set of reasoning because you are already starting with the mindset that either there is no God or God does not intervene in history. That's already a conclusion that you are starting as a logical premise to come to the conclusion that there is no God or God does not intervene in the world. So, of course, you're going to get there if that's your premise already. He basically says that, their argument is in that way, it's a fallacy. It's not a true argument for the lack of existence or the lack of intervention of God. And then he wants to come in with, well, there's this whole realm of human experience, centuries, millennia of human experience of God as an agent in human history, which they're just discounting.
And that's it. I think the way we see this played out is the dichotomy between confirmation and coincidence, that our premise that we're sitting in is going to be confirmed every time we see it, and we're going to discount everything else as coincidence. And yeah, you see it as a real tension in the world that when there is something confounding, people don't want to deal with it because it would dismantle the whole premise sitting under everything that I've laid my life on.
Absolutely. It's too problematic. It's uncomfortable. It's easier to just ignore. But let's not just stay there. Like I'm talking about this spectrum. And I would say that you and I sit on this spectrum, and obviously we probably sit much closer to Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, John Wesley in
Not
the
in mystical experience, but in our expectation that God interacts in daily life.
absolutely. But I'm just thinking about images of God. Like sometimes when we're doing youth ministry, we do a little drama about images of God and the different images people have, like, of God as very distant and you need to shout really hard and talk really loud and go over and over and over things in the hope that he might actually hear your prayers, or the sort of image of a Santa Claus God where you give him your list of hopes and desires and try and be really, really good in order to earn what you want from God. So there's like all these sorts of images, but I was thinking about, the average Christian or Catholic today. And so there are Teresa of Avila's out there, there are John Wesley's out there. There are also those out there who sit in the church who probably don't expect that God is going to intervene in the world in my life or in my lifetime, while at the same time believing it's true that he does or could. And a bit further up, maybe there's people that have this belief or experience that God talks to other people, but they don't expect that he would or could talk to them, that God answers other people's prayers. So I might go to a healing mass because that priest has a healing ministry, or I'll get sister to pray for me because she's closer to God and God might answer her prayer. But for some reason, the God who does intervene in the world doesn't intervene through my prayers. And I find that challenging because I can see vestiges of that in myself, that I do pray for healing and I do talk to God and expect him to respond to me. But every now and again I can feel this, no, no, you pray for the water to be turned into wine because my own belief that God might do that for me is I can believe that God does it or would do it, but possibly not in answer to my prayers.
I reckon I had a fail in this over the summer. So I was with a friend at her workplace and took me into the section that kind of is an open community center. And there was a person there who wanted to make a little friendship bracelet for me. And more than, like just connecting, I know that one of the gifts that we have to bring is prayer. And I said, "Oh, I can pray with you too." And she gave me her prayers and prayed on the spot. It was a really beautiful moment, right? But I was walking away and I was like, oh, almost the more evangelizing thing would have been to then say, and can you pray for me?
Ooh.
To acknowledge that God is not separate from her life and God can move through her. And yeah, I walked away and I was like, wow, I was just as you're talking, I'm thinking it's so easy, even for us who are somewhere on the spectrum, because we're in relationship with other people that have that mindset, it can sometimes just be easy to fall into that. So I think part of our work in evangelization, in being missionaries in the world, is to not just say that's God for me, but that's actually God for you too.
And to model it, like I'll pray for you, but I'm not buying into the story that God answers my prayers and he doesn't answer yours. So
Yes.
I'm going to pray for you, but then I'm going to ask you to pray for me.
Yes.
Wow, that's really cool. I was thinking the homily this morning at the mass I went to really spoke beautifully into this actually. So the gospel this morning at mass was the one where Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And the priest like was about a two-sentence homily, and he pretty much said, look, this is the perennial question for every person, and especially every Christian down through the ages, and we need to ponder it deeply. Who do we say that he is? And I think what rises in me as I think about, what Taylor is saying in this chapter is that the question that is asked, if you like, by this slice of history is who do we say that God is? Not just who is Jesus, but who is God? Is he primarily the architect and first cause of the universe who will judge us at the end of time? Or is he someone who, to a greater or lesser extent, and that's the question we have to ask personally and respond personally to, will be active and present in my life as another person who I have a relationship with?
Mm.
And more than that, like someone who's active and intervenes and it was all powerful. There's so many facets of that as you start to ponder, like, who is God for me?
And that then leads to and what am I expecting of him?
Yeah. And how am I sharing that with others? Or how does my life actually respond to that? Or how is my life consistent with that? Do I believe one thing in my head but live something else in my daily actions?
Beautiful. That sounds like a perfect spot to end for today, of just holding that question of who am I saying that God is? What does that mean? And how am I responding to what that means in my daily life?
Amen.
This has been Contemplating Culture, a podcast produced by the missionaries of God's Love Sisters. For more information from today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes. We pray that today has blessed you, and most importantly, we invite you to continue the conversation.